Daniel Hayes gripped the cardboard box so hard his knuckles went white, and for one long second he almost hurled it off the porch into the wet grass. 3 weeks he'd carried this thing in his trunk. 3 weeks he'd told himself he'd drive out here, drop it, and never look back at the friendship that had died in silence. But the man he came to face wasn't the one who opened the door. A woman he'd never met stood there instead, and the first thing she said wasn't hello. It was a question that cut straight through him, one no person had dared ask in over a year. What she said next changed the entire course of his life. Before we go on, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight, so I can see how far this story travels. And if stories about second chances still mean something to you, subscribe and follow along, because this one's just getting started. Part 1. The drive out to the suburbs took Daniel Hayes an hour and 11 minutes, and he spent most of it arguing with a man who wasn't in the car. "You never called." He muttered, both hands tight on the wheel. "Not once. Not when Sarah died. Not when the funeral came and went, and I stood there in a suit I hadn't worn in 10 years, looking around for one face I recognized. You knew. You had to have known. And you stayed away." The box sat on the passenger seat where a person should have been. Inside it were the pieces of Mark Carter's life that had somehow ended up in Daniel's garage. 2 paperback novels with cracked spines. A gray fleece jacket that still smelled faintly of somebody else's house. A coffee mug with a chip on the rim, and a folded flannel shirt Mark had left behind the last night the two of them had spoken like brothers instead of strangers. That was almost 2 years ago now. Before the accident. Before everything. Daniel's jaw worked as he took the exit. He'd rehearsed what he was going to say at the door. He'd rehearsed it 100 times, and every version came out sharper than the last. "Here's your stuff. I don't need it in my house anymore. I don't need the reminder." That was the plan. Drop the box, say something cold enough to close the door on 12 years of friendship for good, and drive home to his son. He hadn't planned on the woman. He pulled up to the curb outside the house, a modest 2-story with a sagging gutter and a wind chime that had lost half its chimes, and sat there for a moment with the engine ticking. His hands wouldn't quite let go of the wheel. "Just do it," he told himself. "You've buried harder things than this." He got out. He took the box. He walked up the path, and before he could lose his nerve, he knocked 3 times hard, the way a man knocks when he's already decided he doesn't want to be invited in. Footsteps. The lock, the door swinging open, and there she was. Not Mark. A woman maybe 28-30 at most, with dark hair pulled back and tired eyes that weren't unkind. She looked at Daniel's face first, then down at the box in his arms, and something moved behind her expression that he couldn't read. "You're—" she started. "I'm looking for Mark," Daniel said, too fast, too flat. "I've got some of his things. He can have them back." The woman didn't reach for the box. She didn't step aside either. She just held the edge of the door and studied him with a quiet steadiness that made him feel absurdly like he was the one who owed her an explanation. "You're a friend of his," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I was." Daniel heard how it came out and hated it. "It's complicated. Look, is he here? I've got to drive back and my son's with a sitter, so if you could just—" "He's not here." Something in her voice made Daniel stop. It wasn't the words. It was the way she said them, careful, like she was setting down something breakable. "Okay," he said. "When's he back? I can leave it on the porch." The woman was quiet a second too long. "Come in," she said finally. "Please. I'd rather not do this on the doorstep." Every instinct Daniel had told him to set the box down and walk away. He'd come here for a transaction, not a conversation. He didn't do conversations anymore. Somewhere in the last 20 months, he'd learned how to talk to exactly 2 kinds of people, his 6-year-old son and the man in the mirror, and he'd stopped being any good at either one. But there was something in her face he didn't have a name for yet, and against every plan he'd made on the drive up, his feet carried him over the threshold. "I'm Emily," she said, closing the door behind him. "Emily Carter, Mark's sister." "Daniel." He shifted the box awkwardly. Daniel Hayes. He watched her go still at his name, just for a heartbeat. Then it passed. "Set the box down anywhere," she said. "You want water, coffee? You look like you've been on the road." "I'm fine. I really can't stay." But he set the box on the couch and he didn't leave. The living room was small and lived in the kind of room that belonged to people, not to a magazine. There were shoes by the door in 2 different sizes, a blanket half folded over the arm of a chair. On the mantel, a row of photographs Daniel made himself not look at. Emily came back from the kitchen with a glass of water anyway and pressed it into his hand. "Sit," she said. "You drove an hour for a man who isn't here. The least I can do is let you catch your breath." He sat mostly because his legs were suddenly tired in a way that had nothing to do with the drive. "So, how do you know Mark?" she asked, taking the chair across from him. "We grew up together. Same street, same schools. He was—" Daniel stopped. The word best friend got stuck somewhere in his chest. "We were close, for a long time. And then life happened." He turned the glass in his hands without drinking. "People drift. You know how it goes." Emily nodded slowly, like she was giving him room to say more, but Daniel didn't take it. He'd learned to leave sentences unfinished. It was safer that way. You couldn't be asked follow-up questions about the parts you never said out loud. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Depends what it is." The corner of her mouth lifted not quite a smile. "That's fair." She looked at him for a moment longer. And then she asked the question, the one he would replay in his head for weeks afterward, the one that reached in past every wall he'd spent nearly 2 years building brick by careful brick. "How have you been living?" she said quietly, "since everything got heavy?" Daniel felt the words land like a hand on a bruise he'd forgotten he had. "What?" he said. "You heard me. What makes you think anything's—" "Because I know that face." Emily leaned back, her voice gentle, but sure. "I've been looking at that face across kitchen tables for 3 years. Men who are carrying something they've decided they have to carry alone. You walked in here holding that box like it weighed 200 pounds, and it isn't the box that's heavy." Daniel opened his mouth to say something dismissive, something to close the door on this too. "I'm fine. I don't know what you're talking about. I really have to go." Instead, to his own horror, his throat tightened. "My wife died," he heard himself say. 20 months ago, car accident. She was driving home from her sister's, and a truck ran a light, and that was—" His voice cracked, and he stopped, jaw-clenching. "That was that." Emily didn't gasp. She didn't reach for his hand or tell him she was sorry. In that automatic way, people did, the way that always felt more like closing a subject than opening one. She just sat with it. With him. "What was her name?" she asked. Nobody asked that anymore. Everybody asked, "How are you holding up? And is there anything you need? And are you eating?" But nobody asked her name, as if saying it might break him further, as if she'd become a wound instead of a person. "Sarah," Daniel said. And something in him loosened, just slightly, just enough to hurt. Her name was Sarah. How old was she? 31. And you've got a little one. Emily glanced at the shoes by the door, then back at him. "I saw it in your face when you mentioned a sitter. Ethan. He's 6. Daniel rubbed a hand hard across his mouth. "He was 4 when it happened. He barely remembers her now. That's the part nobody tells you. That the missing keeps changing shape. First you're grieving her. Then you're grieving the fact that your kid is starting to forget her. Then you're grieving the version of yourself that used to know how to be happy, because you can't find that guy anywhere either." The room was very quiet. "I'm sorry," Emily said, and when she said it, it didn't sound like a door closing. It sounded like somebody sitting down beside him in the dark. Daniel stared at the glass of water in his hands. He hadn't said this much out loud to anyone in months. Maybe longer. He talked to Ethan about dinosaurs and school lunches. He talked to his boss about spreadsheets. He talked to the checkout woman at the grocery store about the weather. But this raw center of him, he hadn't shown that to a single living soul. And now, here it was spilling out in a stranger's living room over a box of another man's things. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," he said. Because I asked, Emily said simply. And because I think it's been a long time since anybody did. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. You're not wrong. For a while, neither of them spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable. That was the strangest part. Daniel had spent 20 months learning to fear silence because silence was where the missing lived. But this silence felt different. It felt like company. You want to know something, Emily said eventually. You asked about Mark, where he is. Daniel looked up. He's not coming back today, she said. And I don't just mean today. Something in the way she said it made the hair on Daniel's arm stand up. What do you mean? Emily hesitated. She glanced toward the mantel, toward those photographs he'd made himself not look at. And for the first time, her steady composure flickered. That's a longer conversation than you have time for, she said. You've got a boy waiting on you. Emily. Daniel set the glass down. Is Mark okay? She didn't answer right away. And in that pause, Daniel felt the whole shape of the afternoon shift under him, felt that he'd driven out here angry at a man for a silence he'd never questioned, and that maybe that silence had a reason he'd never once stopped to imagine. Let's just say, Emily said carefully, that you and Mark have more in common than you know, and that the box you brought back isn't the only thing in this house that's been sitting here waiting for someone to come pick it up. Daniel didn't understand her. Not yet. But he understood that something had happened in this family, something big enough to explain 2 years of silence, something big enough that she couldn't say it out loud to a stranger in her living room without her voice changing. I should have called him, Daniel said mostly to himself. After Sarah, I kept waiting for him to reach out first, and he never did, and I got angry, and I told myself he was the one who, God, I don't even remember what the fight was about anymore, something small, something stupid, and I let it become this. That's the thing about the small fights, Emily said. They're never really about the small thing. She stood, and Daniel thought for a moment she was showing him out. Instead, she walked to the mantel, picked up one of the framed photographs, and brought it back to him. He looked down at it. It was Mark Younger laughing, an arm slung around a woman Daniel didn't recognize. But that wasn't what caught him. What caught him was the second frame Emily set beside it, a newer photo, and the man in it barely resembled the friend Daniel remembered. Thinner, grayer, a hospital band just visible on one wrist. Oh, Daniel said softly. Oh no. Like I said. Emily's voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. A longer conversation. Daniel sat back on the couch, the box of Mark's belongings suddenly meaning something entirely different than it had an hour ago. He'd come here to close a door, to say something cold and drive away clean. He'd come here to be done. Instead, he found himself asking the only question that mattered. Tell me, he said. Tell me what happened to him. I've got time. I'll call the sitter. He gestured helplessly at the photographs, at the room, at the whole quiet weight of the house. Tell me. I owe him that much. I owe it to him to at least know. Emily studied him for a long moment. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to find it. Okay, she said, sitting back down across from him. But first I need you to understand something about why I let you in. Because it wasn't an accident, Daniel. When you knocked on that door and said your name, Daniel Hayes, I already knew who you were. Daniel frowned. How? Because Mark talked about you. Emily's throat moved. Right up until the end. He talked about you. And there's a reason he never called you after your wife died. It's not the reason you think. It's not that he didn't care. Then what? He was ashamed, she said. He was ashamed of what was happening to him, and he didn't want you to see it. He didn't want to reach out to a grieving man and become one more heavy thing for you to carry. So he stayed away. He thought he was protecting you. Daniel felt something break open in his chest, quiet and total. All this time he'd nursed a grudge, told himself a story where he was the one who'd been abandoned, and the truth was standing here in a photo frame, thinner and grayer, and holding on to Daniel's name like it still meant something. I need to see him, Daniel said. His voice didn't sound like his own. Emily, wherever he is. I need to see him. I can't. I can't have driven all this way just to leave a box and find out I was wrong about everything." And Emily, for the first time since she'd opened the door, smiled a small, sad, complicated smile, the smile of a person who'd been carrying her own 200-pound box for a very long time, and had just unexpectedly felt someone reach out to help her hold it. "I was hoping you'd say that," she said. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to slant long and gold across the little suburban street. Daniel Hayes had left his house that morning intending to end something. He had no idea, sitting there in that quiet living room with a stranger who already knew his name, that he'd just walked through a door that was about to begin everything. Daniel called the sitter from the kitchen, his back to Emily, one hand braced against the counter. "Mrs. Delgado, it's Daniel. Listen, something came up. Can Ethan stay a couple more hours? I'll pay you double. Yeah, I know it's a school night. Put him on for me, would you?" There was a shuffle, and then his son's voice, high and bright, and completely unaware that the ground had shifted under his father's feet. "Daddy, are you coming home?" "Not just yet, buddy. Daddy's helping a friend." "Which friend?" Daniel closed his eyes. "An old one. A really good one. I'll tell you all about him when I get home, okay? You be good for Mrs. Delgado. Brush your teeth even if she forgets to remind you." "Okay. Love you." "Love you more." He hung up and stood there a moment longer than he needed to. When he turned around, Emily was watching him from the doorway, arms crossed loosely, and there was something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Softer, like she'd just seen a part of him she hadn't expected to. "He sounds sweet," she said. "He's the only thing I got right." Daniel slid the phone into his pocket. "So, you said you'd tell me. I'm not leaving until you do." Emily nodded and led him back into the living room, but this time she didn't sit across from him. She sat next to him on the couch, close enough that he could see her hands weren't quite steady in her lap. "Mark got sick about 1.5 years ago," she said. "Right around the time your wife right around then. That's part of why the timing was so cruel. You were losing Sarah and he was getting the news, and neither of you knew what the other one was going through." "What kind of sick?" "Pancreatic." She said the word flatly, the way you say a word you've had to say too many times. By the time they caught it, it had already spread. They gave him a number. He didn't like the number, so he stopped repeating it. Daniel felt the air leave the room. "How long?" he said. "How long ago did they tell him?" 14 months. He did the math without wanting to. He knew what those numbers meant. Everyone knew what those numbers meant. "Is he—" Daniel couldn't finish it. "He's still here," Emily said quickly. "He's alive, Daniel, but he's not at home because he's at a care facility about 20 minutes from here. Has been for 6 weeks. It got to the point where I couldn't manage him by myself anymore. I tried. God, I tried. But I've got a job and I couldn't be there around the clock, and he was falling and—" Her voice caught. She pressed her lips together and got it back under control. "And he made me promise I wouldn't turn our childhood home into a hospital. He said he didn't want the last thing he looked at every day to be a machine." Daniel stared at the box of Mark's belongings sitting on the couch between them. The chipped mug, the flannel shirt. He'd carried these things around in his trunk for 3 weeks, resentful of the weight of them, and the whole time the man they belonged to had been dying 20 minutes from a house Daniel could have driven to any day. "I didn't know," he said. "Emily, I swear to you I didn't know. I know you didn't. If I'd known, you'd have come." She looked at him steadily. "I believe that. I do. But that's exactly why Mark didn't want you to know. He didn't want you coming out of guilt. He didn't want you sitting by his bed because you felt like you owed him. He wanted—" She stopped, and a strange, painful smile crossed her face. "You know what he wanted. He wanted to fix it before you found out. He had this whole idea in his head, that he'd get through treatment, come out the other side, and then he'd call you all better and say, 'Hey, sorry, I've been out of touch, want to grab a beer?' Like nothing had happened. Like he could just skip over the ugly part and come back to you whole." Daniel had to look away. Because that was so exactly like Mark, proud, stubborn, allergic to being pitied, that he could hear his old friend saying it could see the sheepish grin Mark always got when he'd let too much time pass without calling. "He always did that," Daniel said hoarsely. Even when we were kids. He'd disappear for a couple weeks, then show up like nothing was wrong, big smile, some ridiculous excuse. Drove me crazy. He never grew out of it. No, I guess he didn't. They sat with that for a moment. There's more, Emily said. And I need to tell you this part because it's the reason I really let you in. It wasn't just that he talked about you. It's that a few weeks ago, he started asking for you, by name, over and over. Daniel's head came up. Asking for me. The medication does strange things to him some days. He drifts. He gets confused about what year it is where he is. But even on the bad days, even when he can't remember what he had for breakfast, he remembers you. He'll grab my hand and say, "Did Daniel come? Is Daniel here yet?" And I have to tell him no, every time. I have to look at my brother and tell him no. The one person he keeps asking for hasn't come because he doesn't know you're coming. Because I didn't know how to find you. Her voice was cracking now, and she let it. You have no idea what it was like opening that door and hearing you say your name. Daniel felt his own eyes burning. He hadn't cried in front of another person since the funeral. He'd trained himself out of it. But something about this, about the sheer wasteful sadness of two friends grieving in parallel, each one, certain the other had walked away, it broke something loose in him. Take me to him, he said. Right now, please. Emily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and stood up so fast it was almost a lunge, like she'd been waiting for permission to move. Grab your coat, she said. Visiting hours end at 8. If we go now, we've got time. The drive to the facility took 19 minutes, and Daniel spent all of them white-knuckled in the passenger seat of Emily's car, his own vehicle left behind at the house. He'd offered to follow her, and she'd said no. Absolutely not. You're not driving right now, look at your hands. And she'd been right. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. What do I say to him? Daniel asked somewhere around the halfway point. What am I supposed to say? It's been almost 2 years. The last real conversation we had was a fight. You don't have to say anything profound. Emily kept her eyes on the road. He doesn't need a speech. He just needs to see your face. That's the whole thing, Daniel. That's all he's been asking for. Just your face. What if he's angry? He's not angry. What if the last thing he remembers is the fight? Then you tell him you're sorry, and he tells you he's sorry, and it's over. That's how it works between people who love each other. It doesn't take as long as you think. She glanced at him. The hard part isn't the forgiving. The hard part is getting in the room. Daniel looked out the window at the passing streetlights and thought about all the rooms he hadn't gotten into over the last 20 months, all the calls he hadn't returned, all the invitations he'd let die, Sarah's mother who'd stopped trying to reach him, the friends who'd hosted dinners he never showed up to, his own brother 3 states away, who he talked to twice a year now instead of twice a month. He'd built a fortress out of grief, and he'd told himself it was protection. And the whole time, it had just been a wall keeping everyone out, including the people who could have helped him carry it. I stopped answering the phone, he said quietly. After Sarah. Did you know that about me? You said you knew who I was. Did Mark tell you that part? He told me you were the best man he ever knew, Emily said. That's what he told me. Daniel had to press the heel of his hand against his eyes. The facility was a low brick building with warm lights in the windows, and inside it smelled like the things those places always smell like: antiseptic and cafeteria food, and something floral trying to cover both. Emily signed them in at the desk, exchanged a familiar nod with the night nurse, and led Daniel down a hallway lined with doors, and with every step his heart pounded harder. He's in 114, she said. At the end, he might be asleep. If he's asleep, we don't wake him. Deal. Deal. But when they reached the door, it was cracked open and a lamp was on inside, and a voice, thin, rasping, unmistakably, Mark's called out. I heard you talking to somebody. Emily looked at Daniel. She mouthed a single word. Ready. Daniel wasn't ready. He would never be ready. He nodded anyway. She pushed the door open. Mark Carter was propped up in a bed that made him look smaller than Daniel had ever seen him, and Emily hadn't been kidding about the photographs. The man in that bed was a ghost of the friend Daniel remembered. Cheeks hollow hair, thinned to almost nothing, an IV line taped to the back of one hand. But the eyes were the same. The eyes found Daniel standing in the doorway, and they widened, and for one terrible second Daniel thought Mark didn't recognize him. Then Mark's mouth fell open. "No," Mark said. "No way. No way in hell." "Hey, Mark," Daniel managed. "Danny." Mark's voice broke on the second syllable. Nobody had called him Danny in years. Nobody but Mark, who'd been calling him that since they were 9 years old. "Danny Hayes. Is that, am I dreaming? Am I dreaming? Is he real?" "He's real," Emily said, and her voice was wet. "He came, Mark. He finally came." Daniel crossed the room in 4 steps and took his friend's hand, the one without the IV, and Mark gripped it back with a strength that surprised him, that shouldn't have been possible in a body that frail. "You came," Mark whispered. "You son of a gun. You actually came." "I'm here." Daniel's throat was so tight he could barely speak. "I'm sorry it took me so long. I'm so sorry, Mark. I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know." "Course you didn't know. I made sure you didn't know. Stupid. So stupid." Mark laughed, and it turned into a cough, and Emily moved fast to hand him a cup of water with a straw, and Mark waved her off with one trembling hand, eyes still locked on Daniel. "I kept telling myself I'd call you when I beat it. When I was better, kept moving the goalpost. Next month, after the next round, after the scans came back. And the scans never came back the way I wanted, so I just kept waiting." His eyes filled. "And I ran out of time to wait. And I thought I thought the last thing between us was gonna be that dumb fight about what was it even about." "I don't remember," Daniel said, and it was the truth. "Neither do I." Mark laughed again, hoarse and wet. "Isn't that something we threw away 2 years over something neither of us can even remember?" "We're not throwing away anything else," Daniel said. "You hear me? I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." And Mark's face crumpled, and this proud, stubborn man who'd spent his whole life allergic to being pitied finally let himself be held, gripping Daniel's hand against his chest like a lifeline, and Daniel felt every wall he'd built over 20 months come down at once. Emily slipped out of the room to give them privacy, and Daniel would find out later that she'd stood in the hallway with her hand over her mouth, crying as quietly as she could, because she'd been waiting 14 months to see her brother's face look like that. They talked for over an hour. Mark faded in and out, sometimes sharp and sometimes drifting, and Daniel learned to follow him wherever he went. When Mark was lucid, they talked about the old days, the summer they'd tried to build a raft and nearly drowned in the reservoir, the girl they'd both had a crush on in 10th grade, the road trip after graduation, where the car broke down in the middle of nowhere, and they'd spent the night sleeping in a diner booth. When Mark drifted, Daniel just held his hand and listened to whatever came out. "You take care of that boy of yours," Mark said at one point, apropos of nothing. "Ethan. That's his name, right? Em told me. You take care of him." "I will." "You gotta let people in, Danny. I know you. I know how you get. You put your head down and you push everybody away and you tell yourself you're being strong. But that's not strong. Strong is letting people help you." Mark's grip tightened. "You promise me. You promise me you're gonna let people back in." Daniel's vision blurred. "I promise. And my sister." Mark's eyes drifted toward the door where Emily had gone. "She's been carrying all of this by herself. Our folks are gone, you know that. It's just been her. She works herself half to death at that center, and then she comes here and takes care of me, and she never once complains, and it's killing me, Danny. It's killing me to watch her carry it alone. Somebody's got to help her carry it after I'm—" He stopped, swallowed. "After. Mark, just look out for her, okay? That's all I'm asking. She'd never ask for it herself. She's too much like me, that's the problem." A weak grin. You two would drive each other crazy. In a good way, maybe. Daniel didn't know what to say to that, so he just squeezed his friend's hand and said, "I'll look out for her. I promise you that too." Around 8, the night nurse came to tell them visiting hours were over, and Mark was fading anyway, his eyes heavy, his words slurring at the edges. Daniel stood to go, and Mark caught his sleeve. You'll come back, Mark said. This isn't the only time. I'll come back tomorrow, Daniel said. And the day after that. And every day I can. I mean it, Mark. You're stuck with me now. Mark smiled, and his eyes closed, and the last thing he said before sleep took him was so quiet Daniel almost missed it. Knew you'd come, Mark murmured. Always knew it. Daniel stood in the hallway afterward for a long time, not trusting his legs. Emily came and found him there, and neither of them said anything for a while. They just stood in the fluorescent hum of the corridor, two people who'd been strangers 3 hours ago and were something else now, something without a name yet. Thank you, Emily said finally. For coming back with me, for staying. You didn't have to. Yeah, Daniel said. I did. She looked at him, and there was a question in her eyes she didn't ask. He told me to look out for you, Daniel said. Just now. He made me promise. Emily let out a breath that was half a laugh and half a sob. Of course he did. That's my brother. Dying and still trying to organize everybody's lives. She shook her head. You don't have to do that, Daniel. I don't need looking after. I've been fine on my own for a long time. That's funny, Daniel said. That's almost word for word what I've been telling myself for 2 years. She held his gaze a moment longer, and something passed between them, unspoken and careful. Come on, she said. I'll drive you back to your car. You've got a little boy to get home to. The drive back was quiet in a way that felt full instead of empty. When they pulled up beside Daniel's car outside the house, Emily put it in park, but didn't unlock the doors right away. Can I ask you something? She said. You've got a real habit of that. I do. She almost smiled. The center I work at. It's a place for people who've hit bottom and are trying to climb back out. Folks coming off addiction out of the system, people who've lost jobs, homes, families. A lot of them just need to learn how to build a life again from nothing. Practical stuff. How to fix things. How to make something with their hands. How to feel like they're worth something. She turned to look at him. I've been short a teacher for the woodworking and repair program for 2 months. It's part-time. It doesn't pay much. And I have absolutely no business asking you this tonight of all nights when we've known each other for 4 hours. Daniel blinked. You want me to teach woodworking? I want you to think about it, that's all. She held up a hand. I saw the way you were with Mark tonight. I saw the way you talked to your son on the phone. You've got something these people need, Daniel, and I don't think it's carpentry. I'm an office guy. I stare at spreadsheets all day. I fix a leaky faucet on the weekend if Ethan doesn't distract me first. I'm not... You're a man who's still standing after the worst thing in the world happened to him, Emily said. That's the whole curriculum. That's the only thing any of them are really trying to learn. How do you keep getting up? And you know the answer whether you believe it or not. Daniel opened his mouth to say no. It was on the tip of his tongue. No, I can't. I've got enough to carry. I can't take on anybody else's broken pieces when I can barely hold my own together. The wall was right there, ready to go back up. But then he heard Mark's voice in his head. You gotta let people in, Danny. Strong is letting people help you. I'll think about it, he heard himself say. That's all I can promise right now. I'll think about it. That's all I asked. Emily unlocked the doors. Go home, Daniel. Kiss your kid. And come see Mark tomorrow. He's going to want to know you didn't disappear again. I won't disappear. He got out of the car, then leaned back down before he shut the door. Emily, for what it's worth, I'm glad it was you who opened the door today, and not him. Something flickered across her face. Yeah, because if it had been Mark, I'd have dropped the box and driven off like the coward I've been for 2 years. You didn't let me do that. He tapped the roof of the car. You asked me a question nobody's asked me in 20 months, and it cracked me right open, and I think it might have saved my life. So, thank you. He shut the door before she could respond and got in his own car and started the engine, and only then let himself feel the full weight of the day come crashing down. He didn't drive right away. He sat in the dark with his hands on the wheel, The same wheel he'd been arguing with a ghost behind 6 hours earlier, and he thought about how differently the day had gone than he'd planned. He'd left home that morning intending to end something, a friendship, a chapter, a piece of his own past he was tired of dragging around. He'd wanted to close a door. Instead, a stranger had opened one. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he'd just added to his contacts an hour ago. "Mark's already asking the night nurse if you're coming back tomorrow. Told you. Emily." Daniel read it 3 times. Then he typed back, "Tell him wild horses couldn't stop me." 3 dots appeared. Then, "He's going to love that." Then a moment later, "Drive safe. Text me when you're home so I know you made it." And Daniel, who hadn't had a single person besides a paid babysitter care, whether he made it home safe in almost 2 years, felt his eyes sting all over again. He drove home slowly, carefully, and when he pulled into his own driveway 40 minutes later, Mrs. Delgado met him at the door with a raised eyebrow and a whispered report that Ethan had fought sleep for as long as he could and finally passed out on the couch waiting for him. Daniel paid her double as promised, thanked her twice, and carried his son up to bed. Ethan stirred halfway up the stairs, blinking his small arms wrapping around Daniel's neck. "Daddy, did you help your friend?" "I did, buddy. Is he okay?" Daniel paused on the landing holding his son and thought about how to answer that. About the man in the bed at the end of the hall in room 114. About numbers Mark had stopped repeating. "He's real sick, Ethan," Daniel said gently. "But he was really happy to see me, and I'm going to go see him a lot now. Maybe you can come meet him someday. Would you like that?" "Yeah," Ethan mumbled into his shoulder. "Does he like dinosaurs?" Daniel laughed, and it came out shaky. "You know what I bet he does. I'll ask him tomorrow." He tucked Ethan in, sat on the edge of the bed until the boy's breathing went slow and even, and then went downstairs and stood in his own quiet kitchen for a long time. The same kitchen where he'd eaten 1,000 silent dinners over the past 20 months. It felt different tonight. It felt like maybe it didn't have to stay silent forever. He took out his phone and typed one more text. Made it home. Kids in bed. And Emily about the teaching thing. I'm not saying yes yet, but I'm not saying no. Ask me again in a few days. The reply came almost instantly. I'll hold you to that. Daniel set the phone down on the counter, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't feel like the last man standing at the bottom of a well. He felt like somebody had just lowered down a rope. He didn't know yet how much was about to change. He didn't know about the visits that would fill the coming weeks, the way Mark's face would light up every single time he walked through the door of room 114. He didn't know about the phone call that would come at 3 in the morning, 6 weeks from now, or the way Emily's voice would sound when she made it, or how he'd be the one she called first before anyone else in the world. He didn't know about the center, and the men who'd teach him as much as he taught them, and the slow, unexpected way his own broken pieces would start to fit back together in the act of helping other people gather theirs. All he knew standing in his kitchen that night was that he'd knocked on a door expecting to say goodbye. And someone had answered it with a question instead. A question that reached all the way down to the bottom of him and pulled. How have you been living since everything got heavy? For the first time in a very long time, Daniel Hayes thought the honest answer might finally be about to change. The next morning, Daniel woke up before his alarm for the first time in a year and a half. He lay there in the gray light for a minute, waiting for the usual weight to settle on his chest, the leaden thing that pinned him to the mattress most mornings and made getting up feel like climbing out of a grave. But it wasn't there. Not gone exactly. Just lighter. Like someone had taken one brick off the pile. He made Ethan pancakes. Actual pancakes from scratch, not the frozen ones he'd been reheating for months. Ethan sat at the counter in his dinosaur pajamas and watched with open suspicion. You're making the real kind, Ethan said. I am. Why? Daniel flipped one and it landed crooked in the pan. Does a dad need a reason to make pancakes for his favorite kid? You only make the real kind on birthdays and Christmas. And that stopped Daniel, cold spatula in hand, because his 6-year-old had just told him something about the last 2 years that no therapist could have put more plainly. That somewhere along the way, the ordinary joys had become so rare in this house that his son had learned to track them like holidays. "Well," Daniel said, clearing his throat, "maybe I'm going to start making them more." "Because of your sick friend." Daniel set a plate in front of him. "Yeah, buddy, kinda because of my sick friend." He dropped Ethan at school, drove to the office, and got through the morning on autopilot. Spreadsheets, emails, a meeting where his boss talked for 40 minutes about quarterly projections, and Daniel nodded in the right places and didn't absorb a single word because his mind was 20 minutes across town in room 114. At lunch, he didn't eat. He drove to the facility instead. Mark was awake and sharper than he'd been the night before, propped up against his pillows with a paperback open on his lap that he clearly hadn't been reading. When Daniel appeared in the doorway, Mark's whole face changed. "You came back," Mark said. "You actually came back." "Told you. Wild horses." "Emily read me your text. I about cried." Mark set the book aside. Sit down, sit down. Don't just stand there like a mailman. How much time you got?" "Boss thinks I'm at a dentist appointment, so 45 minutes before I turn into a liar." Mark laughed, and this time it didn't turn into a cough. "Some things never change. You were always the guy who felt guilty for taking his own lunch break." They talked, and it was easier than the night before, because the shock had worn off, and what was left underneath was just the two of them, the way they'd always been. Mark wanted to know everything. About Ethan, about work, about the house. And Daniel found himself telling him things he hadn't told anyone, the small daily defeats of single fatherhood, the school forms he forgot to sign, the parent-teacher conferences where he sat alone in a chair meant for two. "You know what the worst part is," Daniel said. "It's not the big stuff. Everybody warns you about the big stuff. The first birthday without her, the first Christmas. You brace for those. It's the little stuff that gets you. It's reaching for 2 toothbrushes out of habit. It's the second pillow. It's putting away groceries and realizing you bought her brand of coffee because your hands just did it without asking your brain." Mark listened, and he didn't try to fix it, and Daniel understood suddenly that this was a thing dying men and grieving men had in common. They'd both learned that some pain doesn't want solving. It just wants a witness. "I get it," Mark said quietly. "The little stuff. For me, it's you know what it is. It's that I keep planning. My whole life I've been a planner. Next week, next month, next year. And now my brain still does it. It still goes in the spring. And then it catches up to itself and remembers there might not be a spring. That's my little stuff, Danny. My brainwriting checks my body can't cash." Daniel's chest ached. "Mark, don't!" Mark held up a hand. "Don't do the sad voice. I get enough of the sad voice. That's the one good thing about you being gone 2 years. You don't know how to do the sad voice with me yet. Everybody else has had months of practice. You're the only person left who still just talks to me like I'm a person." He grinned. "Don't ruin it." So Daniel didn't ruin it. He talked to Mark like a person. He told him a stupid story about a coworker who'd gotten his tie caught in a paper shredder, and Mark laughed so hard the nurse poked her head in to check on him. And for those 45 minutes, room 114 didn't feel like a place where someone was dying. It felt like two old friends who'd found their way back to each other, which is exactly what it was. When Daniel had to leave, Mark caught his hand again, the way he had the night before. "Hey," Mark said. "Emily talked to you about the center." Daniel went still. "She mentioned it." "You gonna do it?" "I don't know, Mark. It's a lot. I've got Ethan, I've got the job." "Do it," Mark said. And there was no joke in his voice now, no grin. "Danny, listen to me. I don't have a lot of things I can still do. I can't fix my own situation. I can't take care of my sister the way I want to. Most days, I can't even take care of myself. But I can still do this one thing. I can still point my best friend toward the thing that's going to save him, because I can see it. I can see it clear as day, and you can't yet." His grip tightened. "That center is going to give you back to yourself. I know it. Trust me. Trust a dying man's eyes, because we see things straight." Daniel couldn't answer for a second. That's not fair, he finally said, playing the dying card. Yeah, well. Mark smiled weakly. Gotta use the cards I got left. Daniel went back to work that afternoon and got exactly nothing done. At 3, he texted Emily. Just came from seeing Mark. He ambushed me about the center. Said I have to do it. Said it's going to save my life. He plays dirty. Her reply came a few minutes later. He gets that from our dad. Guilt was his second language. Then, a moment later. But he's not wrong, Daniel. He's usually not about people. It's his one gift. Daniel stared at the message, then typed, Can I come see the place? Just to look. Not committing to anything. Tomorrow. Saturday. I'll be there setting up. Come by around 10 and I'll show you around. Bring Ethan if you want. There's a kids area and honestly, it does the guys good to see a little one running around. Reminds them what they're climbing back up for. And so the next morning, Daniel found himself driving to a converted warehouse on the edge of the industrial district, with his son buckled into the back seat, peppering him with questions. Is this where your friend lives? No, buddy, this is a different place. This is where Miss Emily works. She helps people who are having a hard time. What kind of hard time? Daniel thought about how to explain addiction and homelessness and prison to a 6-year-old. Grown-up hard times. The kind where they need someone to help them figure out how to start over. Like how you had a hard time when Mommy died. Daniel nearly missed the turn. In the rearview mirror, Ethan was looking out the window, completely matter-of-fact, the way kids deliver the sentences that gut you. Yeah, Daniel said quietly. Kind of like that. Did somebody help you start over? And Daniel thought about Emily standing in her doorway 2 days ago, asking him a question that had cracked him open like a walnut. He thought about Mark gripping his hand and pointing him towards something he couldn't see yet. They're trying to buddy, he said. They're really trying to. Emily was waiting for them out front, and when she saw Ethan clamber out of the back seat, her whole face softened in a way Daniel felt somewhere in his chest. You must be Ethan, she said, crouching down to his level. I'm Emily. Your dad told me you're an expert on dinosaurs. Ethan's eyes went huge. I know all of them, even the ones nobody can say. Well, that's perfect because we have a coloring wall inside and nobody's been able to draw a proper dinosaur on it yet. Think you could help me out? Ethan looked at Daniel for permission, got a nod, and took off through the doors like he'd been coming here his whole life. He's wonderful, Emily said, standing back up. He's got her eyes, doesn't he, Sarah's? Daniel blinked. How did you? There's a picture. Mark keeps it by his bed. You and Sarah and the baby, from before. She said it gently. I've been looking at your family for a year, Daniel. I feel like I already knew you before you ever knocked on my door. That landed strangely. This whole time Daniel had thought he was the stranger walking into their lives, and it turned out he'd been living in a photo frame in room 114 the entire time, watched over by a dying man and the sister who loved him. Come on, Emily said. Let me show you the place. Inside the warehouse had been transformed. There was a big open common area with mismatched couches and a coffee station. A kitchen where 2 men in aprons were prepping what smelled like a genuinely good lunch. A wall covered in art. Some of it good. Some of it just heartfelt. And off to one side, the coloring wall where Ethan was already down on his knees with a fistful of markers. Down a hallway there were smaller rooms. A computer lab. A room set up like a mock job interview space. And at the very back behind a set of double doors, a workshop. Emily pushed the doors open and Daniel stopped. It was a real wood shop. Table saws, a lathe, workbenches, pegboards hung with tools. But it was dusty, untouched, a layer of neglect over everything. This was the heart of the place, Emily said. The founder started it 15 years ago. He believed there was something about working with your hands, making something real out of raw material that healed people in a way talking never could. And he was right. For years, this was where the guys spent most of their time. It's where they built their confidence back, where they learned they could still create something instead of just destroy things. She ran a finger through the dust on a workbench. And then he passed away. 2 years ago. And we lost the one person who knew how to run this room. We've had a couple of volunteers try, but nobody stuck. And every month it sits empty, I watch the guys drift a little. Because the talking helps, but the making is where they find out they're worth something. Daniel walked slowly through the shop, running his hand along a workbench, feeling the grain of the wood under the dust. Something stirred in him that he hadn't felt in a long time. His father had been a carpenter. Daniel had grown up in a shop just like this one, handing his old man tools, learning to measure twice and cut once, learning that a thing you built with your own hands was a thing nobody could take from you. He'd forgotten that. Somewhere in the last 20 years of spreadsheets and cubicles, he'd forgotten that he came from people who made things. "I'm not qualified to run a program," he said, but his voice didn't have much conviction in it. "You keep saying that." Emily leaned against the doorframe. "You know what qualified means. It means somebody's willing to show up and give a damn. That's the whole qualification. These men have been failed by every qualified person in their lives. Judges, landlords, bosses, family. You know what they haven't had? Somebody who just shows up week after week and treats them like they're worth teaching. That's the job, Daniel. The woodworking is just the excuse." Daniel picked up a hand plane from the bench, turned it over. It was a good one. Old. The kind of tool that had made 1,000 things. "Can I meet some of them?" he heard himself ask. "The guys. Before I decide anything, can I meet them?" Emily smiled. "I was hoping you'd ask." She took him back out to the common area where lunch was being set out and introduced him around. There was Ray, a big man in his 60s with prison tattoos going gray on his forearms, and the gentlest handshake Daniel had ever felt. There was Marcus Young, maybe 22, jittery 3 months clean and terrified of every hour. There was Tomas, who'd lost a construction business and a family to the bottle and was clawing his way back. There was Walt, closer to Daniel's own age, who'd been a machinist for 30 years, until the plant closed, and the depression that followed had cost him everything. They were wary of Daniel at first, the way people who've been let down a lot are wary of a new face. But when Emily mentioned the woodshop, something shifted. "You gonna open the shop back up?" Ray asked, and there was a carefulness in the question like he was afraid to hope. "I'm thinking about it," Daniel said honestly. "Mr. Pearson, the founder, he taught me to build a chair," Ray said. "First thing I ever made in my whole life that somebody didn't tell me to make. 61 years old, and I'd never built a single thing. Just broke things. That chair's in my apartment right now. I look at it every morning." His voice got rough. "Ain't been able to make nothing since he passed. Shop's just been sitting there." And that was the moment Daniel knew. Not because of the wood shop, or the guilt Mark had loaded onto him, or even because of Emily, but because of the look on Ray's face, a 61-year-old man who'd finally learned he could build something instead of break it, and had lost the one place that let him. "Tell you what," Daniel said. "Give me a week to figure out my schedule with my kid and my job, and then let's build some chairs." Ray's face broke open into a smile, and Marcus whooped, and Tomas clapped Daniel on the back, hard enough to stagger him. And Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in almost 2 years. He felt useful. Across the room, Emily was watching him with her arms crossed and an expression he was starting to be able to read. And when their eyes met, she just gave him a small nod. "Told you." They got lunch, all of them, at the long communal table, Ethan wedged between Ray and Marcus, and telling them everything he knew about the Cretaceous period, while they listened with the total attention of men who'd forgotten what it was like to be around a kid. And Daniel sat there in the middle of it, eating a genuinely excellent bowl of chili made by a man rebuilding his life surrounded by strangers who felt less like strangers by the minute. And he thought, "This is the first meal I've eaten at a full table since Sarah died." He had to look down at his bowl for a second, so nobody would see his face. Afterward, as they were packing up to leave, Emily walked them out to the car. Ethan was clutching a drawing Ray had helped him make, chattering happily, and Emily buckled him into his booster seat like she'd done it 100 times. "He's going to sleep the whole way home," she said, straightening up. "Fresh air and new friends. Knocks him out every time." "Thank you," Daniel said. "For today." And for you keep doing this thing where you give me back pieces of myself I thought I'd lost. I don't know how you do it. I don't even think you're trying." Emily was quiet a moment. "Can I tell you something, and you can't take it the wrong way?" "Okay. I'm not just doing this for you." She glanced back at the building. "Watching you in there today, watching you come alive a little. It's the first time in 14 months I've felt like something good was happening, instead of just something ending. My whole life right now is about my brother slipping away one day at a time. Every conversation is a goodbye I'm pretending isn't a goodbye. And then you walked into that shop and picked up that hand plane, and I saw a beginning, Daniel. A real one. And I needed that. I needed to see something begin." Her voice caught. "So don't thank me. We're helping each other. That's what this is." Daniel looked at her. This woman who'd been carrying her dying brother and a warehouse full of broken men all by herself, who'd opened her door to a stranger and found a way to save them both. And he felt something he wasn't ready to name. Something that scared him a little this soon, with Sarah's coffee still in his cupboard. So he didn't name it. He just said, "Then we're helping each other." And Emily smiled, and something passed between them again, that same unspoken thing, and this time, neither of them looked away quite as fast. His phone rang on the drive home. Ethan was already asleep in the back, exactly as predicted, the drawing slipping from his fingers. Daniel answered on the hands-free. "Danny." It was Mark, and his voice was strong, almost giddy. "Emily just texted me. She said you're gonna do it. The shop. She said you told the guys you'd teach 'em. News travels fast. You have no idea what you just did. Ray's been asking about that shop for 2 years. You're gonna change that man's whole life, and the young one, Marcus. I met him. He's scared. He's scared because he's 3 months clean and every day is a war. And now he's got a reason to show up. You gave him a reason to show up, Danny. You don't even know what you did." Mark's voice thickened. "This is what I meant. This is the thing I could see and you couldn't. And now you can see it too, can't you? I can hear it in your voice." Daniel gripped the wheel. "Yeah," he admitted. "Yeah, I think I can." "Good." Mark exhaled. "Good. Then my work here is done." He laughed. "Well, not done. But you know, one thing off the list." "What list?" There was a pause, and when Mark spoke again, something in his tone had shifted, gone quieter and more careful. "Everybody's got a list, Danny. When you get to where I am, things you gotta square away before you know. And getting you and Emily connected, getting you into that shop that was near the top of mine. So thank you for letting an old friend cross something off." Daniel felt a chill go through him. "Mark, what do you mean getting me and Emily connected? I thought I came back for you." The pause stretched a little too long. "Course you did," Mark said. "Course you did. Just an old man rambling. Don't mind me. Come see me tomorrow." Mark: "Come see me tomorrow, Danny. Bring the kid if you want. I'd love to meet him. Ask him if he likes dinosaurs. I got a joke I've been saving." And he hung up before Daniel could push, leaving Daniel to drive the rest of the way home, with a strange new thought turning over in his mind. Getting you and Emily connected. As if that had been part of Mark's plan all along. As if a dying man had looked at his grieving best friend and his exhausted, lonely sister and seen something neither of them had let themselves see yet. Daniel shook it off. Mark was on a lot of medication. He said things sometimes that drifted. It didn't mean anything, but it stayed with him. All through that evening, as he carried a sleeping Ethan up to bed and then sat alone in his kitchen, it stayed with him. The next few weeks moved faster than any stretch of time had moved for Daniel in almost 2 years. He rearranged his life around 3 fixed points: Ethan, the office, and the center. He worked out a schedule with his boss to leave early 2 afternoons a week and spend Saturday mornings at the warehouse. He cleaned the woodshop from top to bottom, Ray and Marcus and Tomas working alongside him, all of them coughing in the dust and cracking jokes, and slowly, without any of them quite noticing, becoming something like a team. They started with chairs, simple ones. Daniel taught them the way his father had taught him: measure twice, cut once, respect the tool, and the tool respects you. Ray, it turned out, had real hands for it. Marcus was clumsy, but relentless, and every time he finished something without breaking it, Daniel watched a little more of the fear go out of his eyes. Walt, the old machinist, knew more than Daniel did about half the machines, and slowly came back to life as he remembered he was good at something. Tomas worked in near silence, but he worked, and one afternoon Daniel caught him running his hand along a finished tabletop with tears in his eyes, and neither of them said anything about it. And in the middle of all of it, there was Emily. She was there most days, moving through the center, like it was an extension of her own body, knowing every man's story, every man's bad day, every man's reason for being there. Daniel watched her talk a shaking Marcus down from a relapse one afternoon, sitting with him for 2 hours until the craving passed, and he thought he'd never seen anyone do anything more quietly heroic in his life. They fell into a rhythm, the two of them. She'd bring him coffee in the shop. He'd stay late to help her lock up. They talked in the spaces between everything else about their lives, their losses, the strange parallel griefs that had brought them together. He learned that she'd given up a career in the city to come home and run the center after Mr. Pearson died because she couldn't stand to watch the place close. He learned that she'd been engaged once years ago, and that it had ended badly, and that she'd more or less decided love wasn't in the cards for her. He learned that she was funnier than her tired eyes let on, that she did a devastating impression of every man at the center, that she cried at commercials and hid it. And she learned him. The real him, not the grieving shell he'd become. She pulled stories out of him about Sarah, good ones, funny ones, until he could say his wife's name without his throat closing. She got him to laugh a real laugh, the kind he hadn't done in so long. It felt like a muscle he'd forgotten how to use. She never pushed too hard, never asked for more than he could give, but she was there steady and warm, and Daniel found himself thinking about her at odd hours, driving to work, lying awake at night, which terrified him. Because every time he felt something warm toward Emily, Sarah's ghost stood up in the back of his mind. The coffee still in the cupboard, the second pillow, the wedding ring he still hadn't taken off. And the guilt would come crashing down, and he'd pull back, go quiet, put a little distance between them for a few days until the shame passed. Emily noticed. Of course she noticed. She noticed everything. But she never called him on it. She just held her ground and waited, giving him room the same way she'd given him room that first day in her living room. And through all of it, Mark was fading. Daniel visited every few days, and he could see it, the slow subtraction happening in room 114. Mark slept more. The lucid stretches got shorter. Some days Daniel would arrive, and Mark would be sharp and funny, and full of questions about the shop, and other days he'd be somewhere else entirely. Calling Daniel by his father's name, asking about people who'd been dead for decades. But even on the worst days, two things stayed constant. Mark always knew Emily, and Mark always asked about the center. "How's Ray's chair coming?" he'd ask. Or, "The young one Marcus, he's still showing up." Or, "You looking after my sister like I told you?" And Daniel would give him the report, and Mark would nod satisfied, crossing invisible items off his invisible list. One afternoon, about a month in, Daniel arrived at the facility to find Emily already there, sitting by Mark's bed holding his hand. Mark was asleep. Emily looked like she hadn't slept in days. "They moved him to a different care level this morning," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off her brother. "The doctor pulled me aside. He said..." Her voice wavered. "He said it's weeks now, Daniel. Not months. Weeks." Daniel sat down heavily in the chair beside her. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. He just reached over and took her free hand the way she was holding Mark's, and the three of them sat there in the quiet, connected in a line. "I'm not ready," Emily whispered. "I keep thinking I'll get ready. I've had 14 months to get ready, and I'm not. I'm not ready to be the last one. Our parents are gone, Daniel. When Mark goes, there's nobody left who remembers me as a kid. Nobody left who knew our mom's laugh, or the way our dad whistled. It'll just be me carrying all of it alone." And Daniel, who knew exactly what it was to be the last one holding the memories, squeezed her hand and said the only true thing he had. "You won't be alone. I know it doesn't fix it. I know I can't be what he was. But you won't be carrying it alone. I promise you that. I promised him, and now I'm promising you." Emily turned and looked at him, her eyes brimming, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. And then, so quietly, he almost didn't catch it, she said, "Why does it feel like I've known you my whole life? We met a month ago." "I don't know," Daniel said. "I've been trying not to think about it." "Me too." From the bed, Mark stirred. His eyes opened cloudy, then focused, and he looked at the two of them sitting there, holding hands over his blanket, and something crossed his face that Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. It was peace. Pure, uncomplicated peace. "Finally," Mark murmured, a ghost of his old grin tugging at his mouth. "Took you too long enough." And then his eyes drifted closed again, and he slept, leaving Daniel and Emily sitting there, stunned hands still clasped both of them, suddenly aware of what a dying man had seen in them before either of them had dared to see it in themselves. Neither of them let go of the other's hand for a long time after that, and neither of them mentioned what Mark had said. But it sat in the room with them, that single word finally, and Daniel drove home that night with it echoing in his ears. He didn't sleep much. He lay awake and stared at the ceiling and thought about Sarah and about Emily and about the terrible arithmetic of a heart that had room for a dead wife and a living woman at the same time. He'd read somewhere once that grief isn't a thing you get over, it's a thing you carry, and that eventually you don't get smaller. The grief does, because your life grows around it. He hadn't believed it at the time. Lying there in the dark for the first time, he thought maybe it was true. Around 2 in the morning, he got up and went downstairs and opened the cupboard and took out Sarah's coffee. The bag he hadn't been able to throw away for 20 months. He held it in his hands for a long time, and then quietly, he threw it in the trash. Not because he was letting her go. Because he wasn't, and he finally understood he didn't have to. He could keep her and still make room. The coffee was just coffee. She was in Ethan's eyes and his own heart, and she always would be. And a bag of grounds going stale in a cupboard wasn't honoring her. It was just a small shrine to his own inability to move. He stood there in his dark kitchen at 2 in the morning and felt something shift that had been stuck for a very long time. The next morning, he called Emily before work. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to not make it weird." "That's a great start." "That thing Mark said. Yesterday. The finally thing." There was a pause. "I've been trying not to think about it." "Yeah, join the club. Look, I'm not trying to make anything happen right now. God, the timing couldn't be worse. Your brothers, you've got everything you're carrying, and I've got Ethan, and I just now this morning threw out my dead wife's coffee, which is a whole thing I'll explain someday." He took a breath. "But I don't want to keep pretending I don't feel something. I'm too tired to keep pretending. And I think you're pretending too, and I think we're both doing it out of some idea that it's not allowed, or it's too soon, or it's disrespectful to something. And I wanted to say it out loud, that's all. I don't need you to say anything back." The silence on the line stretched so long he thought the call had dropped. "Emily, I'm here." Her voice was thick. Give me a second. Nobody's said anything that honest to me in a really long time." She exhaled. "You're right. I've been pretending. I've been pretending because my whole life right now is about loss, and the idea of letting myself want something, want someone, when everything else is being taken away, it felt greedy. It felt like I hadn't earned it. Like I should just be grateful to survive the next few weeks and not ask for anything more. I know that feeling. I know you do. That's the problem. That's why it works." She laughed wet and small. "Okay. Here's what I think. I think we say the true thing, which is that there's something here. And then I think we put it in a box on a shelf gently, and we don't open it until after, because I can't do this and grieve my brother at the same time. I don't have enough of myself for both, but I don't want to lose it either. So we name it and we shelve it, and when I'm ready, we take it back down. Can you do that? Can you wait?" Daniel thought about all the doors he'd let close over the past 2 years. All the things he'd let slip away because he couldn't figure out the timing, couldn't find the right moment, told himself later, told himself someday. I can wait, he said. I'm good at waiting. Been doing it my whole life. But Emily, this time, I'm actually going to. That's the difference. I'm going to actually be there when you're ready. I'm not going to disappear. I believe you, she said, and he could hear that she did. The next 2 weeks were a strange, suspended kind of beautiful. Daniel taught at the shop, and Ray finished his second chair and started teaching Marcus the way Mr. Pearson had once taught him, and the whole room began to hum with the particular energy of men who'd found a reason to get up in the morning. He brought Ethan on Saturdays, and the boy became a kind of mascot, adopted by a dozen rough men who competed to teach him things and show him their work and hear his dinosaur facts. And he and Emily circled each other in the careful, tender way of two people who'd agreed to wait brushing hands over a coffee cup, sitting a little closer than they needed to, saying goodnight, a little slower each time. It was there, the thing between them, humming under everything patient. And through all of it, Mark was slipping away. He was mostly asleep now. The lucid windows had narrowed to minutes, sometimes just seconds. Daniel and Emily traded shifts at his bedside, one of them always there. And Daniel found himself talking to his sleeping friend, the way he'd once talked to Sarah in the weeks after the accident, telling him about the shop, about Ray's chairs, about Ethan, about everything, in case some part of him could still hear. One afternoon, a Tuesday, gray and quiet, Mark surfaced. Daniel was alone with him. Emily had gone home to shower and sleep for a few hours, and Daniel had promised to call the second anything changed. He was sitting by the bed reading a magazine. He wasn't really reading when Mark's voice cut through the room clear and strong in a way it hadn't been in days. Danny. Daniel dropped the magazine. Hey, I'm here. You want water? You want me to get the nurse? No nurse. Mark's eyes were clearer than they'd been in a week, focused, urgent. Listen to me. I don't know how long I got this window, so shut up and listen. Daniel, shut up. You and Emily. I saw it. Don't tell me I imagined it, I know what I saw. Mark's hand found Daniel's and gripped it. You gonna take care of her? Daniel's throat closed. Mark, don't mark me, yes or no? You gonna take care of my sister when I'm gone? Yes, Daniel said. Yes, if she'll have me. When she's ready, yes. Mark's eyes closed for a second, and when they opened, they were wet. Good. Okay. Good. Because I need to tell you something. And I need you to hear it right, because I only got the strength to say it once. He gathered himself. The reason I never called you, after Sarah, I told Emily it was because I was ashamed of being sick. And that was true. But it wasn't the whole truth, Danny. There was another reason. And it's been eating me alive, and I can't go without telling you. Daniel went very still. What are you talking about? The fight. Mark's voice dropped. The one neither of us can remember. I lied. I remember it. I remember every word of it. I've remembered it for 2 years. The room seemed to tilt. Mark, you told me Sarah was pregnant again. That's what the fight was about. You came to me so happy, so damn happy, telling me you two were having another baby, and I... Mark's face contorted. I was jealous, Danny. I'd just found out my wife and I couldn't have kids. We'd been trying for years, and we just found out it was never going to happen for us. And you came to me glowing about your second baby, and I said something cruel. I said something so cruel, I can't even repeat it. About you not deserving what you had. And you walked out, and I let you. Daniel couldn't breathe, because he remembered now. He remembered all of it. The memory he'd buried so deep, he'd genuinely convinced himself it was gone. Sarah pregnant, the two of them so happy. The fight with Mark. And then Sarah lost the baby, Daniel whispered. 3 weeks later. And then 4 months after that, the accident. I know. Mark was crying openly now. I know. And every cruel word I said I had to live with, knowing you lost that baby, and then you lost her, and I never got to take any of it back. I was too ashamed. First, I was ashamed of what I said. Then I got sick, and I was ashamed of that too. And the shame just kept stacking up until it was a wall too high to climb. That's why I never called Danny. Not the cancer. The cancer was just my excuse. The truth is, I couldn't face you, because the last thing I ever said to you was that you didn't deserve your family. And then your family got taken away, and I couldn't live with myself." Daniel sat there with his dead friend's confession landing on him piece by piece, and he waited to feel angry. He waited for the betrayal, the fury, the wound reopening. 2 years he'd told himself a story about a friend who'd abandoned him in his darkest hour. And here was the real story, uglier and more human, and more heartbreaking than anything he'd imagined. But the anger didn't come. What came instead was grief. Enormous, aching grief, not for himself, but for Mark. For his proud, stubborn, broken friend, who'd carried this alone for 2 years, who'd been dying with it eating him from the inside, who'd been so certain of his own unforgivability that he'd let a whole friendship die rather than risk being turned away. "Mark," Daniel said, and his voice was steadier than he'd ever imagined it could be. "Look at me. Look at me." Mark forced his eyes open. "I forgive you." "You can't." "I do. I forgive you. Right now, completely, all of it." Daniel gripped his friend's hand with both of his. "You said something cruel, because you were in the worst pain of your life, and you couldn't have the one thing you wanted most in the world. That doesn't make you a monster, Mark. That makes you a man who was hurting. And you paid for it. God, you paid for it. You spent 2 years drowning in guilt over words. You lost me over it. You almost died without me because of it. You've suffered enough. It's done. It's over. You hear me? I forgive you, and there's nothing left to forgive, and you can let it go now." Mark broke down completely sobbing, and Daniel leaned in and held him. This frail, dying man held him like a brother and felt the wall between them. The wall Mark had spent 2 years believing was too high to climb, simply crumble to nothing. "I'm sorry," Mark wept. "I'm so sorry, Danny. I'm so sorry about the baby. I'm so sorry about Sarah. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I should have been there. I should have been at the funeral. I should have been holding you up, and instead I was hiding." "You're here now," Daniel said. "We found our way back. That's the only part that matters. We found our way back." They stayed like that for a long time until Mark's sobs quieted, and his breathing evened out, and Daniel eased him back against the pillows. "There's one more thing," Mark said, exhausted, now his voice fading. "In the box. The one you brought back. The flannel shirt. Check the pocket. I put something in there 2 years ago the last time I saw you, and I never got to give it to you. I meant to. And then everything happened." His eyes were drifting closed. "Check the pocket, Danny." "What is it?" But Mark was already sinking back into sleep, a small, peaceful smile on his face. The smile of a man who'd finally set down a weight he'd been carrying too long. "Love you, brother," Mark murmured. "Always did." "Love you too," Daniel said. "Always will." And Mark slept. Daniel called Emily and told her to come back, that Mark had woken up, that they'd talked, that she should come. He didn't tell her the rest, not over the phone. That was a conversation for in person, if he ever had it at all. Some of what Mark had confessed felt like it belonged only to the two of them, a debt settled between brothers. Emily arrived within the hour, and she sat with Mark holding his hand, and Daniel drove home to relieve the babysitter and put Ethan to bed. And before he did, he went to the garage, and he found the box, and he took out the folded flannel shirt he'd resented carrying around for 3 weeks, and he checked the pocket. There was an envelope inside. Worn soft, the corners rounded from 2 years of sitting folded in a shirt. On the front, in Mark's handwriting, it said one word, Danny. Daniel's hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a letter dated almost exactly 2 years ago, 3 days after their fight, and a check. The letter was short. Mark had never been a man of many words on paper. It said, Danny, I said the worst thing I've ever said to anybody, to the best friend I've ever had on the happiest day of your life. I don't know how to take it back. I don't know if you'll ever talk to me again, but I know you and Sarah were stretched thin with one kid and another on the way, and I know pride's gonna make you tear this up. So let me say it plain. This is for the baby. For the new one. Every kid deserves a start, and I want to give yours one, because I couldn't give my own kid anything, because there isn't gonna be one. Don't argue with me. Just take it. And someday, when we're old men, we'll laugh about the dumbest fight we ever had. Your brother Mark. The check was for $10,000. Daniel sat down on the cold garage floor and wept, because the baby that check was meant for had never been born. Because the fight they were supposed to laugh about, as old men had, instead cost them 2 years and nearly cost them everything. Because Mark had written this 3 days after the cruelest thing he'd ever said, already trying to make it right, already reaching back across the distance, and Daniel had never known had spent 2 years believing his friend didn't care, when the truth was, Mark had cared so much, he couldn't face him. He would never cash the check. He knew that immediately. It would go in a frame or a drawer or somewhere he could look at it and remember. But it wasn't about the money, and it never had been. It was about a man who at the lowest moment of his own life had still tried to give something to the friend he'd wronged. Daniel folded the letter back into the envelope, and he made a decision. The next morning, he was at the facility by 7. Mark was sleeping, but Daniel sat down and took his hand anyway. "I found it," he said quietly, in case Mark could hear. "The letter. The check." "Mark, you idiot. You beautiful idiot. 2 years. We lost 2 years, and it was all sitting in a shirt pocket in my garage the whole time." He pressed his forehead to his friend's hand. "But I found it. And I want you to know I understand now. I understand everything. And it doesn't change anything I said. I forgive you. I forgave you before I even read it. But now I know how hard you tried right from the beginning, and it makes me love you more, not less. You hear me? More, not less." Mark's eyes didn't open, but his fingers just barely tightened around Daniel's hand. And that was enough. Emily arrived, and the two of them spent the day at the bedside, and it became clear as the hours passed that the window Mark had surfaced through the day before had been the last of the good ones. He was going now. The nurses moved differently, spoke more softly. They'd seen this 1,000 times, and they knew the shape of it. That evening, with the light going gold and low through the window, with Emily holding one of her brother's hands and Daniel holding the other, Mark Carter took a breath and let it out and didn't take another. He went easy. He went at peace. He went with his sister and his best friend on either side of him, holding on, and the last thing Daniel had said to him an hour before, leaning close to his ear, was, "It's okay to go, brother. Everything's squared away. Everything's forgiven. I've got her. I've got the shop. I've got the guys. You did it all. You crossed off the whole list. You can rest now. You can rest." And Mark had rested. For a long time afterward, neither Daniel nor Emily moved. They sat on either side of the still quiet figure that had been Mark, and they held his hands, and they held each other's grief across the space between them, and outside the window, the day slowly went dark. "He waited," Emily finally whispered. "The doctor said days for over a week. He kept holding on. I couldn't figure out why." She looked up at Daniel, her face wet and wrecked, and somehow underneath it all at peace. "He was waiting for you. He was waiting to fix it. Whatever you two talked about yesterday, whatever it was, that was it. That was the thing he was hanging on for. He couldn't let go until he'd made it right with you." Daniel couldn't speak. He just nodded, tears running freely down his face, and thought about a box of belongings he'd almost thrown into the wet grass 3 weeks ago. A box he'd resented. A chore he'd put off for weeks. And how that box, that stupid box of a dead friendship's leftovers, had turned out to be the thread that led back to everything, to forgiveness, to Emily, to the shop, to a room full of broken men learning to build, to a version of himself he'd thought was gone forever. If he'd thrown the box away, if he'd left it on the porch, if he'd driven off cold the way he'd planned, he would never have known. Mark would have died alone with his guilt. Emily would have carried it all by herself. The letter would have gone to a landfill. And Daniel would have gone on being the last man standing at the bottom of a well, never knowing there'd been a rope the whole time coiled in a shirt pocket in his own garage. "I almost didn't come," he said hoarsely. "That day, I almost left the box on the porch and drove away. I was so angry, I had a whole speech ready, something cold to close the door for good." He looked at Emily. "And you opened it instead. And you asked me a question. And it changed everything." Emily reached across her brother's still form and took Daniel's hand, threading her fingers through his. "He knew," she said softly. "Somehow I think he knew that if he could just get you to that door, if he could just get you and me in the same room." A broken laugh escaped her. "The whole thing, the center, us. He set all of it in motion from a hospital bed. My brother, dying and still the most stubborn matchmaker in the state of—" Her voice cracked and gave out. Daniel came around the bed and pulled her into his arms, and she came finally letting herself be held, and the two of them stood there over the body of the man who'd brought them together, and grieved him, and each other, and everything that had been lost, and everything impossibly that had been found. The funeral was 3 days later. Daniel gave the eulogy. Emily had asked him to, and he'd said yes before he could talk himself out of it, and he'd stayed up 2 nights writing it, and thrown all of it away, and in the end just spoke from his heart. He stood up in front of a room full of people, Emily in the front row, Ethan beside her, in a small borrowed suit, and behind them filling half the church every single man from the center, Ray and Marcus and Tomas and Walt, who'd never even met Mark, but who'd come because Daniel had asked, because Daniel was theirs now, and Mark was Daniel's, and that made Mark theirs too. "I lost my best friend twice." Daniel began, his voice shaking and then steadying. "Once 2 years ago over a fight so stupid neither of us could remember it. And once 3 days ago in a room with the light coming in gold through the window holding his hand. The 2 years in between, I want to talk about those, because I spent them thinking Mark had walked away from me, and I was wrong. The truth is, Mark never walked away. He got lost. There's a difference. He got lost in shame and in fear and in a sickness he didn't want anyone to see. And he wandered in that wilderness for 2 years alone when all he had to do was call. All either of us had to do was call." He looked out at the room. "So here's what I've learned, and it's the only thing I know for sure. Don't wait. Whatever it is, the fight, the grudge, the apology stuck in your throat, the friend you've been meaning to call, don't wait. Don't tell yourself someday. Someday is a lie we tell ourselves to avoid the discomfort of today. I almost lost Mark forever to someday. I almost drove away from his door with a box of his things and a cold heart, and I would have carried that for the rest of my life." His voice broke and he let it. "The only reason I didn't is that a good woman opened a door and asked me a hard question. And I'll spend the rest of my life grateful she did." He found Emily's eyes in the front row. She was crying, and so was he. And Ethan reached up and held her hand, this 6-year-old, who barely understood any of it, but understood that the 2 grown-ups he loved were sad. And Daniel watched his son comfort the woman. His best friend had died, hoping he'd love, and thought his heart might crack straight open. "Mark spent his last weeks giving things away," Daniel finished. "Not money, not stuff. He gave away forgiveness he thought he didn't deserve. He gave me back a wood shop and a room full of men who needed teaching. He gave me back myself. He gave me—" Daniel stopped and looked at Emily again and made a decision right there at the podium that he hadn't planned to make. "He gave me a future I'd stopped believing I was allowed to have. That was Mark, right up to the end. A man who couldn't fix his own life, spending every ounce of strength he had left, fixing everybody else's." He swallowed hard. "Rest now, brother. It's all squared away. Every bit of it. You did good. You did so good." After the funeral, after the reception, after the men from the center had each shaken Daniel's hand and gripped his shoulder and told him in their rough, halting ways that they were sorry for his loss and glad to be his, after Ethan had fallen asleep in a pew and been carried out to the car, Daniel and Emily stood alone in the empty parking lot as the evening came down. "So," Emily said, "the shelf." Daniel looked at her. "What about it? The box we put on the shelf, the thing between us, that we said we'd take back down when I was ready." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I don't know when I'll be ready, Daniel. I just buried my brother. I'm going to be a mess for a while. I'm going to have days where I can't get out of bed, days where I push you away. I need you to know that going in. I'm not going to be easy, Emily. Daniel stepped closer. I threw out my dead wife's coffee at 2 in the morning last week. I've got a 6-year-old who tracks the good days like holidays because there have been so few of them. I am the last person on earth who's going to ask you to be easy. He reached out and took her hands. I'm not asking you to be ready. I'm just asking you to let me be there while you get there, however long it takes. I already promised your brother twice. Let me promise you once for real. I'm not going anywhere. Emily looked at him for a long moment in the gathering dark. When Mark said, "Finally," she said, "that day, in the room. Yeah. He was right, wasn't he?" It wasn't quite a question. Finally. And Daniel, who had knocked on a door 3 weeks ago, meaning to end something, who had almost thrown a box into the grass and driven off cold, who had lost his wife and nearly lost his best friend, and spent 2 years at the bottom of a well, he thought had no rope. Daniel pulled Emily gently into his arms and held her while she cried, and felt her arms come around him and hold on. Finally, he agreed. They didn't kiss. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was something quieter and deeper than that. Two people who'd found each other in the middle of the worst season of both their lives, agreeing without words to walk the rest of it together. Over her shoulder, through the window of the car, Daniel could see Ethan asleep in his booster seat. And beyond the parking lot, the last of the daylight was slipping away. And somewhere in his garage, there was a check for $10,000 he would never cash, and a letter he would keep forever, and inside his chest, where for 2 years there had been nothing but a locked room and a held breath. Something had finally begun to open. The grief came in waves, exactly the way Emily had warned him it would. The first month after the funeral was the hardest. There were days she called him and said nothing, just breathed on the line, and he'd stay there with her in the silence until she could speak again. There were days she didn't call at all, and he learned not to take it personally, learned to text her something small. Thinking of you, no reply needed, and leave the door open without pushing through it. There were days she showed up at the center with red eyes and a fierce refusal to talk about it, and he let her work, let her lose herself in other people's problems, because he understood that better than anyone. He carried his own grief in those weeks too. Losing Mark had cracked open the old loss underneath it, the way one death always seems to reopen every death before it. And there were nights Daniel sat in his kitchen after Ethan was asleep, and grieved his wife, and his best friend, and the unborn baby all at once. The whole accumulated weight of 2 years of loss finally finding its way out of him. But something was different this time. This time, he wasn't at the bottom of the well alone. This time, when it got bad, he picked up the phone and Emily answered, and they carried it together. "You know what nobody tells you?" Emily said one night, 3 weeks after the funeral. The two of them on the phone past midnight because neither could sleep. "They tell you grief comes in stages. Denial, anger, all that. Like it's a staircase you climb and then you're done. Nobody tells you it's not a staircase. It's a tide. It goes out and you think you're okay, and then it comes roaring back in and knocks you flat. My wife's mother told me something after Sarah died," Daniel said. "She said grief is just love with nowhere to go. All that love you had for the person still there, still full force and no one to give it to. So it just sloshes around inside you and it hurts because love isn't supposed to sit still. It's supposed to move." Emily was quiet a moment. "That's beautiful. I didn't believe her at the time. I thought it was a nice thing people say. But I think she was right. I think that's why the center helps. It gives the love somewhere to go." And that more than anything became the shape of how they healed. Not by talking themselves better, though they talked plenty. By pouring the love that had nowhere to go into a warehouse full of men who needed it. The shop became Daniel's church. He was there every afternoon he could manage, now having worked out a permanent arrangement with his boss to go part-time at the office, taking a pay cut he could barely afford, because he'd finally understood what Mark had been trying to tell him. That a life spent staring at spreadsheets to fill a bank account he didn't enjoy wasn't a life, it was just a slow way of not living. He'd rather have less money and more of whatever this was. This thing that happened when Ray finished a cabinet and stood back and looked at it like a man seeing proof he still existed. This thing that happened when Marcus, 6 months clean, now taught a brand new arrival how to sand a board, and Daniel watched the kid who'd been terrified of every hour turn into someone with something to give. 2 months after the funeral, they held the first show. It had been Emily's idea, and then it had become everyone's idea, taking on a life of its own. The men had been building for months now, and they had things, real things, beautiful things. Chairs and tables and cutting boards and jewelry boxes, and a rocking cradle Tomas had built over 6 painstaking weeks, working on it in silence, refusing to say who it was for until the very end, when he finally admitted it was for the grandchild. He'd never met the one his estranged daughter was carrying, the one he was hoping, praying the cradle might be a way back to. They set up the common room like a gallery. They invited families, the ones who still had families and people from the neighborhood, and Daniel's co-workers, and the whole thing had the feeling of something bigger than a craft sale. It felt like a resurrection. A room full of men the world had written off, standing next to things they'd made with their own hands, watching strangers admire their work, seeing in real time that they were not, after all, only capable of breaking things. Ray sold every piece he'd made within the first hour. A woman bought his best chair, the twin of the one he kept in his apartment, and when she shook his hand and told him it was the most beautiful chair she'd ever seen. This 61-year-old man with prison tattoos going gray on his forearms had to turn away and press the back of his hand to his eyes, and Daniel, watching from across the room, felt Mark beside him as surely as if his friend were standing there. "You see this?" Daniel thought. "You see what you started. You pointed me at this from a hospital bed. You stubborn, dying man. And look what grew." Tomas's cradle didn't sell because it was never for sale. But halfway through the afternoon, the doors opened and a young woman came in, very pregnant. Hesitant, scanning the room until she found her father, and Tomas went absolutely still. And then his daughter crossed the room and stood in front of the cradle he'd built for her baby, and she looked at it for a long time, and then she looked at him, and she said one word: "Dad." And Tomas, who had lost a business and a marriage and a decade to the bottle, who had worked in silence for months, building a cradle for a grandchild he was terrified he'd never be allowed to meet, took his daughter in his arms, right there in the middle of the room, and the whole place went quiet, and grown men who'd seen everything the world had to offer wiped their eyes and looked away to give them privacy. Emily found Daniel's hand in the crowd and held it, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that the room wasn't already saying. Later, after the show, after the cleanup, after the last family had gone home, and Ethan had been picked up by Mrs. Delgado for a sleepover with her grandkids, Daniel and Emily sat alone in the empty common room among the tables and the leftover coffee and the ghosts of everything that had happened there that day. "He would have loved that," Emily said. "Mark, he would have loved every second of it." "He was here," Daniel said simply. "The whole time. You know he was." Emily leaned her head on his shoulder, and Daniel put his arm around her, and it was the most natural thing in the world. Now the two of them worn smooth by months of shared grief and shared purpose into a shape that fit. "Can I take the box down off the shelf now?" she asked quietly. Daniel's heart stopped, then started again. "The box. The one we said we'd open when I was ready." She lifted her head and looked at him, and her eyes were clearer than they'd been in months. The fog of the worst grief finally starting to lift. "I think I'm ready, Daniel. Not all the way. I don't think you're ever all the way ready. But enough. I'm ready enough. And I'm tired of waiting for perfect, because Mark taught me the hard way that perfect never comes, and someday is a lie." A small, wet laugh. "You want to know something? I've been ready for a while. I've been sitting on it. Because I was scared. Because letting myself be happy felt like leaving him behind." "I know that feeling too," Daniel said softly. "I lived in it for 2 years. How did you get out of it?" "I threw out the coffee." He smiled. "And then I met a woman who opened a door and asked me a question." Emily laughed, and it turned into something else, something with tears in it. And Daniel reached up and brushed them away with his thumb, and this time, finally, he leaned in, and she leaned in, and they kissed gently in the empty room. where so much had been broken, and so much had been rebuilt, and it felt less like a beginning than like a homecoming. Like two people who'd been walking toward each other from very far away, finally arriving at the same place at the same time. When they broke apart, Emily pressed her forehead to his. "He set this up, you know," she whispered. "My brother. From his deathbed, the whole thing. He got you to that door. He put us in that room. He practically wrote the ending himself." "Stubbornest matchmaker in the state," Daniel said. "Stubbornest matchmaker in the whole country." They laughed and held each other, and outside, the light was going down on a day that had started as a craft show and become something none of them would ever forget. They took it slow after that. They had to. Grief doesn't run on a schedule, and neither does a 6-year-old, and Daniel was so careful about bringing Emily into Ethan's life as anything more than Miss Emily from the center. But children see more than adults give them credit for, and it was Ethan in the end who forced the issue. It was a Sunday, maybe 4 months after the funeral. Emily had come over to help Daniel with dinner, which had become a thing that happened sometimes easy and unremarkable, and Ethan had watched the two of them move around the kitchen together, and finally, he'd set down his crayon and asked the question children ask the one adult spends so much energy avoiding. "Are you and Miss Emily gonna get married?" Daniel nearly dropped the pan. Emily froze at the counter. "Buddy," Daniel started, that's a grown-up. "Because I think you should," Ethan said with the total seriousness of a 6-year-old delivering a verdict. "You laugh now. You didn't used to laugh, and Miss Emily is nice and she knows about the sad stuff, and she doesn't get weird about Mommy. Jaden's mom got a new husband, and Jaden said it was okay because now there's 2 people to help. And I think we could use 2 people." He picked his crayon back up, verdict delivered. That's all. The kitchen was very quiet. Daniel looked at Emily. Emily looked at Daniel. And something passed between them, that same unspoken thing that had passed between them in her doorway on the very first day. Except now they both knew exactly what it was. "Out of the mouths of babes," Emily said softly. "He's not wrong," Daniel said. "About needing 2 people, about the laughing." He crossed the kitchen and took her hand. "He's not wrong about any of it. It wasn't a proposal. Not that day. That day was too soon, and they both knew it, and Daniel wanted to do it right, wanted to give Emily the time and the ceremony, and the certainty she deserved, after everything she'd lost. But it was the moment they both stopped pretending they didn't know where this was going. It was the moment the future stopped being a box on a shelf and became a thing they were actually building board by board, the way Daniel's father had taught him, the way he now taught the men at the shop. Measure twice, cut once, respect the thing you're making, and it'll last. The proposal came 6 months after that, on the anniversary of the day they'd met, the day Daniel had knocked on a stranger's door with a box of a dead friendship's leftovers and had his whole life cracked open by a single question. He took Emily back to that house, Mark's house, which she'd been slowly cleaning out and preparing to sell, and he asked her on the porch. The same porch where she'd opened the door to a grieving man who'd almost driven away. He got down on one knee right where he'd stood that first day, and he told her that Mark had brought them together, but that staying together was their own choice, made new every day, and that he chose her and would keep choosing her for the rest of whatever time they got. She said yes before he finished asking. They were married in the spring in the common room of the center, because there was no other place it could have possibly happened. Ray built the arch they stood under. Marcus, a year clean now, and training to be a counselor, was one of the groomsmen. Tomas came with his daughter, and his brand new grandson, the baby who'd slept in a cradle, built out of a father's desperate hope. And when the baby cried during the ceremony, nobody minded because it was the sound of a family that had found its way back. Walt gave a toast that made the whole room weep. And Ethan, 7, now stood beside his father as the best man, a title Daniel had given him, with complete seriousness, because there was no one who'd earned it more. Emily walked herself down the aisle. She'd thought about it a long time, about who would give her away with her father and her brother both gone. And in the end she'd decided that no one would give her away, because she wasn't a thing to be handed off. She was a woman who'd survived and chosen and arrived here under her own power. But she carried something. In her hands, along with her flowers, she carried a framed photograph of Mark the young one, the laughing one, the brother she wanted to remember, so that he could be there too. So that he could see it. The thing he'd set in motion from a hospital bed. The ending he'd practically written himself. Daniel had kept two things from the box all this time. The letter and the check he'd never cashed. And during the ceremony, when it came time to speak, he took the letter out of his jacket pocket, and he read part of it aloud to the room. The part where Mark, 3 days after the worst fight of their lives, had written someday. "When we're old men, we'll laugh about the dumbest fight we ever had. We never got to be old men together." Daniel told the room, his voice steady and full. "Mark didn't get his someday, but he made sure I got mine. He spent the last strength he had making sure the people he loved would be okay after he was gone. And I stand here today, married to his sister, surrounded by these men he pointed me toward, with my son beside me, who's laughing again, because I'm laughing again, and I know for a fact that Mark Carter didn't lose. A man who gives everything he has away right up to the end, so the people he loves can go on and be happy that man doesn't lose. That man wins. That's what winning looks like. That's the only thing winning has ever looked like." He looked at the photograph in Emily's hands. "We're laughing, brother," he said. "Just like you promised. It just took us a little longer to get here than we planned." And Emily, holding her brother's picture and her husband's hand, laughed through her tears, and the whole room laughed with her. And it was exactly the sound Mark had written about on a scrap of paper 2 years before he died. The sound of a fight forgiven and a friendship restored, and a family made new out of the broken pieces of 2 shattered lives. They built a good life after that, not a perfect one. Grief never fully leaves, and there were still hard days, anniversaries, and empty chairs, and moments when the missing came roaring back in like the tide. But they built the life together, and that made all the difference. Daniel took over running the center full-time when Emily needed to step back, and then they ran it together side by side. The woodshop never sat empty again. Hundreds of men came through it over the years, and every one of them learned the same 2 things Daniel's father had taught him. And Mr. Pearson had taught Ray how to build something real with your own hands, and how to believe you were worth something while you did it. Ethan grew up in that shop. He learned to use a lathe before he learned to drive. He grew up surrounded by men rebuilding their lives, and it made him into the kind of person who saw the worth in people the world had given up on. And when he was older, he'd tell people that the best thing that ever happened to his family was the day his dad almost threw a box into the grass and didn't. Because that was the truth of it in the end. The whole thing had hung on a single moment. A grieving man, angry and closed off, standing on a porch with a box of a dead friendship's leftovers, one decision away from driving off cold and never knowing. He could have left the box on the porch. He could have said something cruel and turned around. He could have kept the wall up the way he'd kept it up for 2 years and driven home to his silent kitchen and his forgetting son and his slow, quiet disappearing. Instead, a door opened. A woman asked a question, and a man who thought he was closing the last chapter of an old life discovered he was standing at the first page of a new one. That was the thing Daniel understood now. The thing he'd spend the rest of his life trying to pass on to every broken man who came through the doors of that center. That sometimes the moment that saves you doesn't look like salvation. Sometimes it looks like a chore you've been putting off. A box you don't want to return. A drive you don't want to take. Sometimes the door to the rest of your life is disguised as the door you're trying to close. Mark had known that. Somehow dying, he'd known it better than any of them. He'd known that if he could just get his grieving best friend to that porch, if he could just get him to knock instead of leaving the box behind, then everything else would follow. The forgiveness, the healing, the love, the whole unlikely beautiful future unlocked by a single knock on a single door. Daniel came to return a dead man's things. He walked away with his entire life. And every morning after, for the rest of his days, when he made his son the real kind of pancakes, when he kissed his wife in the kitchen, they shared when he drove to a warehouse full of men, learning to build instead of break. Every single morning. Daniel Hayes remembered the box he almost threw into the grass, and the question that cracked him open, and the friend who'd loved him enough to set it all in motion from a hospital bed, and he knew beyond any doubt that the door had opened at exactly the right time. It always had been the right time, he just hadn't known it yet.